Welcome to the Midnight Release presents Midnight Reflections with Chase. Today's episode is called Paternal Passions. Welcome back to another solo episode of Midnight Reflections. We started this a couple weeks back when we had a spontaneous episode drop where we talked about 1998 and how important it was to me and potentially to others. And I had mentioned that there was a very good possibility that I would continue to do these. And today is no exception. Today came on kind of spontaneously. I actually woke up this morning and the idea came into mind that, hey, maybe it would be a good day to do an episode of Midnight Reflections. And the reason behind that is very simple. First off, just to remind everyone and break down the format, this is a shorter episode, really just focused on a general narrative and then some reflection. Very clear, very concise, very introspective, if you will. Most importantly, and the reason for today's episode, Happy Father's Day. You know, my son has never asked me to play Metal Gear Solid. Now, he probably shouldn't. He's 5, but you'll get where I'm going here. He's never sat down and watched a full Dragon Ball episode with me. Now, he's watched some AMVs and rewinded them and fast-forwarded them and paused them and continued to repeat that process. He's never told me who his favorite superhero is. And, you know, if you're a parent of a child with autism, you probably understand exactly why those thoughts cross my mind sometimes. But Father's Day in general kind of has a way of making you think about things that you hope to share. The traditions, the hobbies, the memories. And today I've been thinking about the strange journey from growing up without a father to becoming one myself. So with that being said, let's jump into our episode, Paternal Passions. So, my dad was a very horrible human being in a lot of various different ways. And look, this reflection isn't a sob story about me and my issues. I know plenty of people that have had, different upbringings. We all have. But with my dad being as horrible as he was and not present for various reasons, I didn't have necessarily a male figure right out of the gate, if you will. Aside from the obvious one, which I mentioned in the 1998 episode, was my grandfather, my Papaw. And, he was alive until I was 9 years old. And we spent a lot of time with my grandparents and, during those years. Now, I also have, various uncles that played pretty iconic roles during those years. And then when my mom got remarried, my stepdad, of course, played a role in that father figure realm. And then there's my cousin Biggin, of course, as well, who came back around, aside from when I was little, but came back around in kind of those pinnacle teen years where, I had a lot of great experiences and learned a lot from him as a father figure. And, the thing is, when you think about growing up and having a father, and some of this is stereotypes and things like that, and we'll talk about some of the changes of that. But, you think about, inheriting things from your dad. And whether that is not just genetics, but their interests and their hobbies and their passions. And some people go into the same field and the same trades and things like that. And the way the world is now, I think, is totally different from then. But for me, what really kind of triggered the thought behind this episode was this whole podcast has been focused. Yeah, it's a pretty heavily focused on gaming, but we talk about a lot of different things, pop culture related, nostalgia related, and all of that. And in general, for me, I didn't have someone there to tell me like, hey, we need to sit down and play this game together. Oh, check this out. Frankly, I probably had the opposite. The only paternal figure that I had that exposed me to anything game related was my papa. Playing Duck Hunt, playing Super Mario Brothers. We didn't even have the OG NES. We had the top loading one. And, that was really the only time. When I primarily found my exposure to gaming through friends. Now, I will argue that the father figures I did have outside of my grandfather were were the textbook manly man examples, and I love them all very much, but some of the kind of toxic masculinity that you hear about today, and some of those traits, I very much acknowledge. Some of that came from there, and I was ridiculed and belittled by these father figures that I had because of my passions of gaming. And they were the ones that were saying, hey, this is a phase, you're going to grow out of it. Anime, it's a phase, you're going to grow out of it. And I know a lot of my friends, whether they had broken households or not, grew up with a lot of the same mentality. And you're probably hearing this and like, yeah, it's a generational thing. Valid. I do believe that. I do think that there is a generational thing here at play. But, I had to find what basically is my entire personality now on my own. I had friends that had SNESs and Sega Genesis and, N64, but, and look, I mentioned this in 1998. I am not belittling my childhood or talking trash about that. Is not what I'm doing at all. I'm very appreciative for the childhood I had. And when mom got remarried, you know, my friends had an N64, my cousins had an N64, and that was kind of what I wanted. But my stepdad, he wanted to, fresh into that marriage and everything. Now I'm speculating, but he very much wanted to get me this thing that I really, really wanted. But he went with what was the newest thing, which was the PlayStation. And even though he was probably my biggest opposite of advocate, proponent of my gaming passion as my life went on, the entire reason I became a gamer, I've said that Metal Gear Solid made me a gamer in 98. And that's valid. And that came through getting a PlayStation from him. And the entire reason I experienced Dragon Ball, again, was because mom had gotten remarried, went to get my hair cut, and that was a friend of my stepdad's. So, there are things that happen because of father figures in my life, but it wasn't them handing down kind of those hobbies. Frankly, the things that my father figures tried to hand down to me, passion for mechanics, passion for sports, all the societal kind of things that a man should be into. If anything else, I ran the opposite direction from those things. And I still say that to this day. And, I did do the sports thing, for the record. I did try to do that to try and build a relationship with my stepdad. It resulted in a broken leg that was awful, by the way. But, I did go down those paths, to try to appease these relationships. But I frankly ran the opposite direction from them. And you ask anyone that knows me very well, and they'll be shocked that I'm watching NFL football now. And that's because I was so anti-sports for so long, and it's because of how it was kind of drilled into my head that I needed to watch these things. I needed to enjoy these things. And, it's irritating. I feel one of the biggest differences between the way that millennials like myself were raised and how, millennials now are raising their kids are very much more about letting them do or be their own people. And, if they get into the things that you'd like them to get into, then that's outstanding. And that's what I'm seeing to be happening, probably because we all have such what are considered immature or childish hobbies now. But, we very much are growing up differently than how we were raised. And, I have friends that grew up in non-broken homes. that their parents stayed together and they're still together today. And, they still didn't pursue the hobbies and the interest of their dads or their moms for that matter. I don't want to discredit moms here, but it is Father's Day and that's kind of what we're talking about. But, you know, even some of my friends I grew up with, we've talked Howie and Austin and all them, and I met them obviously in my adult life, but friends that I grew up with, and I know you all listen to the pod, Quentin, Corey, Josh, I feel we all had different life circumstances and different households and different circumstances. And some of us, I do think, absorbed of that group, absorbed some hobbies from their dads to a degree, but we all kind of found our own hobbies together and as friends, with what we got into, we ended up getting each other into, and it continued, from there. And, now, and really what made me reflect on this so much today, and we're not getting into the full reflection yet, but was thinking about this concept that who I am as a person, situations drove me to these things, and circumstances drove me to these things that I feel make my entire personality, but it wasn't fed to me from someone else, which is why I think I am so passionate about them, because they truly are mine. And nowadays, it is very, very different. Because the thing is, the things that were trying to be handed down to me, like I said, my dad wasn't around, but I had father figures that were present who tried to hand down things, and I ran the furthest way away from them. Nowadays seems to be very different. And, I have to look at my friends that I have now. And, I'm going to name drop a little bit, but of course I'll be cognizant of a couple different things. But, my buddy Howie and my buddy Brian both, they are fathers as well. And, it is awesome how often we have conversations or see videos or pictures get sent back and forth. And both of their boys, both their kids are right around my son's age as well. We're all about around the same age. But, and look, you guys that listen to this, don't read into this or anything. It's midnight reflections, right? It's just me sitting here talking. It is really cool. It is really cool when they send me pictures and videos of, their kids sitting there, watching Dragon Ball, sitting there playing a Mario game, playing an Astrobot, playing a Dragon Ball game. And not only are they participating actively in the activity, but they are having a blast doing it. And, Austin is a huge Star Wars guy, huge Disney guy. And his same thing, his kids love these things. Now, the thing is, all of us do, in this situation, if our kids didn't show interest in those things, I'm confident in saying that Howie, Brian, Austin, wouldn't force those things on them. But again, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that us millennials hold on to so many things that are deemed by society standards as childish, that we are able to relate to our kids in a totally different way. And, when I see those pictures, or when I get those videos, or when I'm present and I witness those things, and, their kids coming up and asking them questions because they're stuck on a game, or asking to play a certain game, or asking to watch a certain show, it's really cool, and is something that, like, my brain goes two different directions. It goes the directions of being a kid and not having a dad or a father figure to go to with something I was passionate about and then participate. Because yes, I had a lot of very great father figures. None of them, outside of maybe Biggin, really wanted to participate in my hobbies or my passions. Biggin, I played a lot of GTA and a lot of Tiger Woods golf on PS2. But, so I have two moments. I have that, reflecting on my own, growing up as a kid and being like, man, it would have been so cool to go to my dad and be like, hey, let's play this game. Let's do this. But then there's the other part. and that's probably part of why I thought about this morning was, I'm not able to do those things with my son. And we're not, he is 5. He is nonverbal and likes what he likes. And look, people can knock the iPad kid all day long if you want. That's fine. But you know, he's not going to come and tell me, hey, I want to play a game. Hey, let's watch this episode of Dragon Ball. Hey, I'm stuck on this game. Can you help me? And when I see my friends' kids going through that and doing that, or they tell me these stories, it's great. And I'm thrilled and I think it's awesome. And I will always tell them that. And I will always truly feel that way. But there's a part of me internally that does feel a kind of way that I am not able to experience that, because he currently doesn't speak. And, he has his ways of communicating. Absolutely. He's got his AAC device. He drags my hand around to things. And, don't get me wrong. I've totally put on Dragon Ball and to see if he takes any interest, and I mentioned it at the start of the episode. He has not sat and watched an episode of Dragon Ball, but I'll tell you right now, you put on a Dragon Ball AMV playing Master of Puppets or something, he will watch it. He will also rewind and fast forward, all controlling the tablet himself, to get to the various spots that he likes to listen to and or watch. And he doesn't play any games because he doesn't understand the controllers. And I've tried with the Switch and a couple other things, so he doesn't play anything. But he is very passionate about watching certain things. He loves watching the opening, just the opening of Banjo-Kazooie. Huge fan. Huge fan. Does he love going to arcades and hopping around and flapping his hands and being all excited, looking at all the lights and things on these games? This weekend, Jurassic Park was a hit. Transformers was a hit. Mario and Sonic Olympics was a hit. So even though he's not able to tell me, hey, Dad, I love Spider-Man, he does stare at Spider-Man things for the longest period of time, which allows me to potentially deduce that Spider-Man is his favorite superhero. But it's something, that I was just thinking of today. And, he sees the world much, much differently. Not just a generational difference, but the way he sees and views things obviously is different on the spectrum. And I don't know what that is. I don't know what it is he's thinking when he's consuming some of those things. Like, is he thinking, no, Dad, I don't want to watch this, or no, Dad, I don't really care about this. Like I did when my father figures were like, hey, come look at this engine, or come look at this, where I was like, oh, Jesus. I am showing him my interest because I don't know anything else to do, but does he actually enjoy them? I don't know. He can't tell me. And, I hope so. And there's different ways that I can infer that, he also enjoys them. But it's just something that I take a lot of joy in my friends that tell me about what they're handing down to their kids and the things their kids are enjoying. And, they're not just forcing them into clothes that the kids absolutely despise, and things. It's just different, how we were raised, and what I feel was very forced into things that we didn't like and had to find our own things. And now you could argue that we're forcing our hobbies on our kids, but our kids love them. At least every kid I have experienced that is a child of a gamer, a child of a pop culture enthusiast, a child of a anime obsessed person, every kid is into the same thing as their parents. And that was not the case growing up as a kid. Kids were very different from their parents. And I think that's kind of the whole point of why this came to mind, aside from my own personal experiences and lack of experiences and struggles. That was part of it. I woke up this morning and he woke up, and you know he I will say this. I will say one of the things that came to mind. We recently discovered that his AAC device has an icon for Nintendo. We didn't put it on there. It was there. And for whatever reason, he kept hitting it, and I didn't know why. And I know that on the Switch he likes to watch the Banjo-Kazooie opening, but I don't have it up here on the Switch, but I did on the Xbox. He stopped pressing the Nintendo button after I pressed Banjo-Kazooie. So all of that to say, he may not be able to speak and tell me, but maybe that's what that was. Maybe he saw that icon. He's heard us say Nintendo Switch and made the connection. I don't know, unfortunately. But it was something that when that happened, I chuckled. And then, I heard from some buddies about their kids playing different games. So that's what kind of brought all this on, But it is something that ultimately, as I've been talking, I have kind of gotten to the point of, we grew up and were totally different from our parents, from our dads. Now, I have my own internal strifes on that and similarities in genetics and differences, despite my dad not being around. And, if my therapist listens to these, it's like, yeah, we got to get into that. Yeah, we'll get into that. But in general, we're all totally different. When I look at all of my closest friends, whose dads I also am familiar with, totally different people. Totally different. And when I look at my friends' kids and the way that they're growing up, and they're kids, I mean, their entire life is ahead of them. They could turn out to be totally different people too. But their hobbies and their interests and their passions are aligned to their parents. And I think that says something about what you see online right now, that millennial dads are breaking a generational trend with their kids. Yeah. Well, if we, that's kind of the whole thing, really. I guess we ought to kind of reflect on some of these things a little bit. We all grew up differently. This reflection was for me personally, and my friends and the people I'm familiar with and my experiences. But it may not be something that everyone can relate to. I would like to think that, anyone who grew up in a broken home can relate to some of the things I've talked about. Even if you grew up in a not broken home, but had things kind of forced on you that you ran away from, or found your own interest in your own hobbies. Different family dynamics can really shape kind of who we are, but not in a similar aspect. I know a lot of people who grew up in certain situations, and if they would have gone the exact same direction, they would be significantly worse off now than they are. And instead, they ran the opposite direction. Whether it's because of trauma or whether you had stability. I feel there is a remarkable amount of similarities between millennials. And I've learned this through TikToks and so many other things. It's like so many of us had so similar childhoods that it's insane. And I think that goes to our dads too. And, when you see the title of this, whether you're a dad currently or don't have a relationship with your own dad, or have a great relationship with your dad, or your experience was totally opposite from mine. Maybe you grew up with a super nerdy dad who did get you into gaming and everything, and that's great. I'm not gonna lie, if you are one of those people, I will probably, is envy the right word? Maybe, because that would have been really cool. And I think that's something that it would be nice. It would be great if William and I could sit and play Mario Kart, play Mario Party, or start having him navigate a Zelda game, or something like that. And we'll get there, I think, at some point. And Obviously that's the internal introspective aspect of this whole thing. And despite him seeing the world so different from everyone else, and his lived experience being different, aside, not just different because everyone's lived experience is different, but um, because of being on the spectrum, I hope that he doesn't think that I'm trying to force my things on him and he truly doesn't enjoy them. He's not able to tell me that. And if he was, and he ever told me, if you're asking yourself, well, what if he said he hated everything game related and he hated everything anime? That's fine. Be yourself. Like, that's the difference between our parents and us. Like, if my buddy's kids did not want to play games, then they wouldn't. If they didn't want to be super obsessed with Star Wars and go make a lightsaber, they wouldn't. It we are all about passing on our joys and our passions, but not forcefully. But I don't know if I am doing it forcefully or not. All I can do is, if there's a lot of hand flapping and there's a whole lot of sounds that I can't deduce what they are, obviously we enjoy that, which is why we put on Banjo Kazooie. Or why I put on the Mario movie, at least recently. Been a big fan of the Mario movie recently. But, again, my friends that have kids, I don't want you to hear this and be like, oh gosh, I'm not going to share these stories with Chase because he gets in his feels about it. No, I love it. I love hearing about it and it's great. Yeah, do I have a moment? It is what it is. Like, I don't want people to not share their joys because you know, we all control how we react to things. And I am the most introverted person on the planet. The people who know me would argue differently, or the fact that I speak on a podcast for an hour and a half at a time, you would argue you must not be very introverted. No, at my core, that's exactly who I am. And you'll never know that I feel a certain way about hearing those things or seeing those TikToks, of kids opening up. Oh man, I love those stories of the kids opening up game consoles and stuff like that, on Christmas, because you can tell the dad in those videos is going to play with the kid. I tell you, it's just something else, and it was a unique day. Okay, it's Father's Day, and yeah, I just was kind of in my feels this morning, I guess, and realized, you know, Midnight Reflections is a series I said, would sometimes be introspective, sometimes was probably just going to be fun and recapping, but I haven't gotten to a recap yet. And another serious introspective topic came up organically. So that was why we decided to talk about paternal passions today. So look, I hope you enjoy it, and I always appreciate hanging around and listening, whether it's a full episode or one of these reflection episodes. And just like with our main episodes, if you have ideas about these, even though these, like I say, are going to be spontaneous and not on a schedule, let me know. So I'll close it out again by just simply saying, happy Father's Day to all the dads out there. Happy Father's Day to all the dads no longer with us that were actually good human beings. So that is not me saying a subliminal to my own father. As always, some memories are worth lining up for, but others you just got to sit and reflect on.